Welcome to Scriptural Works, a podcast that engages Scripture in new and innovative ways to produce meaning for today's postmodern world. Co-host Greg Camp, Professor Emeritus, Pastor and Biblical Scholar, and Patrick Spencer, Biblical Scholar and Silicon Valley Tech Executive, employ various interpretive approaches to generate new meaning from ancient text, revealing timeless wisdom relevant for ministers, lay leaders, and interested readers of the Bible. Get more podcast articles and other useful resources at scripturalworks.com. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Scriptural Works. I'm with my co-host, Greg Camp. Greg, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Patrick.
We are very excited about this one because we're joined by a very special guest. I would like to introduce her, and then we'll dive into some of the details, including some of her most, she has a lot of publications. We talked a bit about some of her more recent ones, and we can talk about some of the ones that go back a few years as well. Jenny Read-Heimerdinger is a distinguished British linguist and scholar specializing in New Testament textual criticism and Greek manuscripts. Jenny holds advanced degrees in modern languages and biblical exegesis, including a PhD from the University of Wales. Jenny has taught and supervised doctoral research at universities worldwide and currently serves as a research associate at the Catholic University Toulouse. Renowned for her work on Codex Bezae and the Jewish context of Luke's writings, she has published extensively, which we're going to talk about in a moment, sometimes in collaboration with Joseph Ruiz-Camps, including publication of a 4-volume commentary on the Bezae text of Acts, which was published, I think, over a period of 5 or 6 years. It's an unbelievable work. You should check it out. She has most recently published 2 new works, which we'll be talking a bit about during this podcast. And then we also have an episode 2 planned with Jenny, where we'll dive into actual specific passages in some of her interpretations and readings of those. Her most recent works, one that was published, I think, this past year, Luke's Characters in Their Jewish World, being Theophilus. It's published by T&T Clark. It's part of the Library of New Testament Studies. And a year before that, she published Luke in His Own Words, a study of the language of Luke Acts, also part of the Library of New Testament Studies by T&T Clark. I think the latter is quite technical, or is more technical, we'll put it that way. I think we would probably, most readers would and listeners would call it quite technical, whereas the most recent one is more for a general reading audience to expose. And it's really quite interesting because she looks at various characters in Luke Acts, Peter, Barnabas, Paul, among others, James, and so forth, and looks at them from a discourse analysis, literary standpoint, and it's quite fascinating. So, Jenny, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm pleased to be with you.
And your readings of Luke, Acts, and Bezae are quite transformative, and we're going to learn a lot about that today.
I'm excited to be with you to talk about it.
So can you show the listeners of, unfortunately, those who are listening in on some of the podcast channels won't be able to see, but those who are on YouTube can see some of, the covers of the 2 latest books that we just talked about.
So that's the characters. And that's the own words. So the own words is really looking at language. So you're right, that is more technical because it's looking at the Greek. I deliberately aimed it to be more accessible to the general reader. It essentially came out of a series of talks I've been giving online to church audiences, just general interested public. So although there is technical discussion, you don't need to have Greek in order to understand that second one.
Yeah, and I've read the free sample. I don't have an actual volume yet. I plan to do so, and hopefully I can write a book review on it. It'll be interesting to read for sure. You have some other works. Why don't you show our audience a few of those? You've published prolifically over your career.
So because I do work on a manuscript which is not very well known, except for isolated variant readings, a manuscript called Codex Bezae. In order to make it known, I, with a colleague in Spain, whom you mentioned, Josep Rius Camps, we put together a translation of the work of Luke, in other words, the Gospel and of Acts. We put the Greek text there, and on the facing page, I believe, yes, we put, in this edition, it's the English translation. So it looks like that, where you've got the Greek on one page and the translation on the facing page. The problem is, in standard editions of the New Testament text in Greek, Bezae, when I say Bezae, I mean from Codex Bezae, Bezae readings might be put in small print in what's called the apparatus at the bottom of the page, but by no means all of them are there. It's a tiny, tiny selection. That's perfectly normal, because there are thousands of them. There'd be not room to put them all there. But you can't get an idea just by looking at that small print, the critical apparatus. You can't really get an idea of what Codex Bezae is like.
That's a great point.
Another one that we did together, Josep Rius-Camps and I, was a comparison, putting the three synoptic gospels in parallel, and again comparing the three gospels in Codex Bezae with each other, but then we compared them also on parallel pages from Codex Vaticanus, which is the main manuscript that's used for the Gospels in the current Greek edition. Current Greek edition being known as Nestle Aland. So that's Vaticanus, but on the facing page, on the left-hand page, you have Codex Bezae. So that's not only it's a synopsis comparing the three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, but it's comparing the three Gospels within each of the manuscripts as well as across the two manuscripts. There are so many things, so many generalizations about Codex Bezae that are false because they fix on particular variant readings rather than being the whole picture. So our work has very often been to give the whole picture.
Interesting.
Yeah.
We're going to dive into those details. That is fascinating, and we encourage your audience to check out your various publications. The two most recent ones certainly will be of interest to many. And Jenny has published prolifically on a number of different subjects, as we just discussed. She has a lot of different works out there. We encourage your audience to start with her most recent book, and then you can work your way backwards. You will have a lot of reading, needless to say, to do. That will take some time to get through. But her writing is fascinating. It challenges a lot of presuppositions that exist in New Testament textual criticism, and how we approach Luke, Acts, and then she's been doing additional work beyond that, which we'll talk a bit about probably in episode 2. So, Jenny, you didn't start out thinking, I want to be a biblical scholar. I assume that's not the case, because you began your life studying not Greek, at least ancient Koine Greek, but you're studying modern languages at the University of London. What drew you in that direction initially? How did you get down that path?
Okay, the modern languages, I've always been, as soon as I started learning foreign languages, I just loved them. It's my brain happens to find language learning okay. So it was a natural choice from that point of view. But I should maybe point out that for me, learning a language isn't just learning the language, the words, the grammar. Language is it's obviously used for speech, but it's also used for literature. And for me, studying modern languages, as much as anything, was about studying the literature. So how the language is actually used. So that's, in London, I was studying French and English. So even not just foreign languages, but I was doing English as well.
Interesting. Is that where you got your interest in discourse theory and analysis, or where did that spring up?
I know that was, when was this? This was late 60s, early 70s, before people were even really talking about discourse analysis. I did enjoy doing linguistics, but that was much more of a general nature. What did happen when I was at university is that I became interested in Christianity. I was drawn to Christianity initially through my studies. We were looking at lots of different philosophies, and my concern was always, but what's true? My brain is actually very happy understanding what different philosophers and thinkers say, but I wasn't really interested in anyone in particular. All I wanted to know was, yeah, but what's true? And so through various people I knew, I came to be interested in finding out about Christianity. And in the early 70s, I became a Christian, insofar as I recognized that the truth, insofar as I was looking for it, or such as I was looking for it, was in the work and teaching of Jesus.
Fascinating.
Was it at that time that you became interested in biblical scholarship, or was that at a later point in life? You taught for a while in the French-speaking West Africa. Is that where you encountered biblical Greek, or was it back at university days?
No, it wasn't. I don't think it was at university at all. When I was in West Africa, so specifically Ivory Coast, I was teaching English as a foreign language to French-speaking secondary students in a Baptist mission school. And as the only European female teacher on the campus, I was not allowed off campus by myself. Um, I don't think that would, I think even today that wouldn't be allowed, but certainly not in the 70s. And so I often found myself on my own on the campus and bored. So I wrote to a friend in England and I said, can you send me a manual of New Testament Greek? I think it's also fair to say that one of my motivations for wanting to learn Greek was this was a fairly evangelical Baptist mission. And I wasn't at all sure about some of the interpretations they were putting on biblical verses. And so I thought, well, actually, I need to know the Greek. Otherwise, I can't really talk about this. So I essentially taught myself Greek from a manual.
Wow.
You are gifted.
I said, my brain doesn't mind languages. It's very it's not. I can't even sort of claim that I'm particularly disciplined or anything. It's just my brain likes languages.
So was it that encounter that began to shift your academic trajectory? How did you go from there to where you are now? I mean, it's a long
Yeah.
story, a longer trajectory, but what was the big shift for you?
So when I was 2 years in Ivory Coast, when I came back to Britain, because I wanted to pursue this. Okay, so I've got the Greek, but there's still a matter of interpreting Greek, which is what I said earlier about language not just being the language, it's also what language is used for. And you need to know how to interpret modern languages just as ancient languages. So when I came back to Britain in 73, I studied for an MA in, I can't remember, what was it, New Testament.
Biblical exegesis, or that's what I have written down.
That's a later one. No, my MA at King's College in London, 73 to 75, yeah, was, I think it's just New Testament, might have just been Christian theology, something New Testament. The reason I can't quite remember is I didn't get as far as taking the exam because shortly before I got married to somebody I'd met or somebody I worked with in West Africa, a French guy, and that's where the name Heimerdinger comes from. So we got married, and he was studying in Canada, and so I was due to go and live in Canada, and would have missed the final exam. So I followed the course, but I didn't ever do the exams. Yeah,
Sounds like my
but
first
that's
MA.
right. Yeah. And that's when I discovered actually I don't even like I don't mind learning what other people think about theology, but if you ask me what do I think, I just can't get my mind around theology. I don't know if that makes sense, but
That's my
people will often
trajectory as well. So
right, because people will often ask me, well, what do you believe about this or that? And I'll say, I don't know. And to me, this is one of the things I like about Jewish theology is God is so great that with our human minds, there's no reason why we should be able to understand him. And from a Jewish point of view, you can have different conflicting interpretations of something, and they can all hold true. And that was something increasingly, especially after, well, even at the Baptist mission, I find difficult with denominations that want to insist we have the truth. It's something that just feels very foreign to me.
Well, very, very true. Now, you went back and did another, which we alluded to already, a Master's of Arts in Biblical Exegesis at the
Yes.
London School of Theology, and then you did a PhD
Yeah.
at Wells. When did this interest in discourse analysis or theory arise, and when did you become interested in textual criticism?
Okay. So after getting married, we worked for 5 years in Lyon, in just south France, towards the Mediterranean. And while we were there, we had our first child. And again, because my mind constantly needs to be occupied, beyond looking after a small child who was extremely demanding in terms of constantly needing attention and me doing things with her, and still is 40 odd years on. So I negotiated an afternoon off when I went to the Catholic University in Lyon, where they were running exceptionally a course in textual criticism. I didn't really know what textual criticism was. I just knew that, oh yeah, you need Greek. That's fine. It'll help me get on with my Greek. And it's when I got there, I discovered that textual criticism is looking at the manuscripts. In this case, it was New Testament. It could be any ancient work, where we don't have the original. All we have is copies and copies of copies of copies. And that's when I discovered that we don't have the original documents of the New Testament, whatever anybody might like to talk about in terms of the original. We simply don't have them. The first copies we have date from the 3rd century, and even then they're fragments. The first real full manuscripts are middle of the 4th century. So, and you need Greek if you're going to be comparing them. You need Greek, because this is also when I discovered that no two manuscripts are identical. What you want to do with the original inspired word of God is exactly, it falls into this discussion. But we'll put that on one side, because we simply don't have the original inspired words. And I suppose the work of textual criticism, as applied to the New Testament, is as best you can to try to work out at every place of variant reading which one's the earliest.
Mm-hmm.
Even if we can't say which one's the original, we could try and work out which one's the earliest. And that, of course, is the result. That is what textual critics have sought to do over the past 100 years in University of Münster in Germany, in collaboration with teams, especially in the States and in Britain, to produce what I called earlier this Nestle Aland edition. So they've gone through the manuscripts, or a selection of the manuscripts. I say a selection because by the time we get to printing, in other words, when we're no longer copying them by hand, but they now are printed, that doesn't happen until the 16th century. And up between the first ones and the time of printing, there's close on 6,000 copies. And it's only after about the 9th, 10th century that you get almost identical copies. Certainly until the 4th century, there's very little agreement, with a lot of divergence. So that's when I discovered, if I'm going to, my initial aim, as I said, in learning Greek was to see, but what does the text actually say? But now I have an additional problem. I need to know, but what manuscript am I going to use? So that's how I got interested in textual criticism.
And, Codex Bezae, how did you come across it and decide this is what I want to spend a lot of my career pursuing?
So while during those 2 years I studied textual criticism in Lyon, the person teaching us, he's actually has been, he's in his 80s now, but he's been the leading textual critic in France, Christian Anfou. He had an interest in Codex Bezae, and in other manuscripts like it that used to be called the Western text. And he used to assign each of the students, it was an MA course, and each of the, I don't know, we were a handful, maybe 8 students, and week on week we'd be given an assignment. And my first assignment was Acts 8:37, 37, 38, which has apparently a confession of faith by the Ethiopian eunuch, which is missing in most manuscripts. 37, 8:37. And it's where, shall I explain what it is? Is
Yeah,
this
I think that'll be helpful to our audience. Absolutely. Yeah.
okay? So Acts 8:37, which isn't there in the, it's often not translated because it's not there in the Nestle Aland edition, the one that's used for translations. And what so you have this Ethiopian eunuch who meets Philip, or Philip meets him, and Philip explains to him this reading from Isaiah that he's talking about. And at that point, they see water, and the Ethiopian eunuch says, "What's to stop me being baptized?" And at that point, the eunuch stops the carriage, they get in the water, Philip baptizes the eunuch, and he comes out, and the Spirit takes Philip away. And that's the end of the story. But in many manuscripts, and actually Codex Bezae, that page is missing. So it's not even Codex Bezae, but it's manuscripts that would often support Bezae, but actually also a lot of other manuscripts that don't always support Bezae. They have an extra verse. I'm saying verse. In fact, verses weren't invented until the verses are 14th, 15th century. Chapters weren't invented till the 1200s. So whole notion of verses and chapters is anachronistic.
Modern or pseudo modern invention.
Yeah, in order to cope with the quantity of text. But as I said, some manuscripts have an extra sentence. So when the eunuch says, "What's to stop me being baptized?" which is verse 36, because he sees the water, in some manuscripts, Philip says, "If you believe that the Son of God is Jesus, it's permitted." Okay? And my assignment was to explain that verse, those words. So at the time, my husband was studying Hebrew. He was actually working in a Hebrew lab in the university in Lyon. And so I said to him, "I don't know, what am I meant to do with this?" So I read it to him, and he said, "Oh, but that's Jewish." I said, "Okay, tell me how." And he said, "Well, yeah, when a person's going to be baptized in Judaism, if they're not already baptized, if they're not already fully in Judaism, they would have to come into Judaism, and that would be by baptism. And there would be a question and answer session, a bit like at a modern wedding, where the priest says, if anyone knows of anything, any reason why. So when the eunuch says, "What is to prevent me?" that's not a sort of rhetorical, well, why don't we just get on with it? It's, is there any reason to stop me? And Philip says, "No. If you believe," and he doesn't say if you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, it's if you believe that the Son of God is Jesus. Now, that in itself is also a Jewish confession of faith. It's not the eunuch saying, "Well, this is who I think Jesus is." It's the eunuch as a Jew, but he's excluded from full membership in the people of God because he's a eunuch. He's been to Jerusalem to worship, but he wouldn't have been able to because as a eunuch, he's excluded from the temple. He's obviously heard something about Jesus, and he's reading Isaiah on his way home. So when Philip says, "If you believe with all your heart that the Son of God is Jesus," it is permitted. And even that is your Pharisaic legal, I'm saying Pharisaic, it's just a legal term that the Pharisees do use. It is permitted. So suddenly things fell into place. As this isn't, so the traditional explanation was that, later on, because baptisms had confessions of faith, so when they saw that there wasn't one, they put it in. Okay. that didn't make sense, because when I researched the earliest confessions of faith, they are never what we find in Acts 8:37. They are more, in fact, it's the person doing the baptizing who asks the candidate, "Do you believe?" And then the candidate just says, "I do." And what they have to believe is that Jesus is Lord. That isn't at all what's in this early confession of faith. Yeah. So it looked to me, and I would maintain this, it's not that it was added in order to make it conform to church practice, because it doesn't. It's more that it's a confession of faith that doesn't conform to baptismal liturgy once it's brought into the church. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
That's fascinating.
So it's not a question of it being added in to conform. It would have been taken out because it jars against Christian liturgy.
Yeah, interesting.
But for our listeners, this is what we're going to get into in the second episode. So come back for more of this good, juicy stuff.
Yeah, you find that fascinating. Wait for episode 2. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah. So as you get into textual criticism, what are some of the assumptions and methodologies that you begin to question? I mean, you're talking about a specific text here that seems to question the assumptions that things are added, and you're flipping that upside down, saying, no, this was probably original. Or what are some of the other assumptions that you're finding like that?
Okay. So you asked earlier about discourse analysis. Can I pick that up? Because that brings me into this question as well. So 83, we moved back from France to Britain, where my husband, as he was then, we divorced eventually about 20 years ago. But in 83, he took up a post as lecturer in Hebrew at the London School of Theology. And that year, they just happened to start a brand new MA, in fact, their only MA that they ran, called an MA in biblical exegesis. And one of the options was linguistics. And I thought, yeah, that's me, linguistics, especially as you needed Greek for it. And so I wanted to see how linguistics could help with variant readings. And what I did was I went through the whole of the text of Acts. I got started on Acts because of this Ethiopian eunuch. I went through the whole of the text of Acts. I compared Codex Bezae with the manuscript that's mainly used for Nestle Aland, Codex Vaticanus. And I made a list of the types of variant readings. So it's things like conjunctions, word order, the article before proper names. So typically in Greek, you can have the definite article before proper names. So you say the Peter, the James, the Jesus. But there's a lot of variant readings. Prepositions. Are we going to say to or towards, for example? And so I had this list drawn up, and I showed it to the guy who was teaching us linguistics for the MA. He was somebody called Stephen Levinson, who was working with Wycliffe Bible translators as a linguistic consultant. Most of his professional work had been in South America. And as a linguist, more than now just translating, he was acting as a consultant. And he started to apply a discipline that was already being used in ordinary linguistics, non-biblical studies, called discourse analysis. Now, discourse analysis is a branch of linguistics. It developed 50s, at the very earliest 60s, it was becoming more popular for languages generally. Stephen Levinson and his colleagues in the 80s was the first person to apply it to biblical Greek. So what discourse analysis is compared with traditional linguistics analyzes language on the level of the sentence. So it's looking at morphology, meaning of words, syntax, construction of sentences. What discourse analysis is doing is looking at how sentences are put together in a whole, in a broader piece of text, which they would call a discourse. That's the meaning of discourse. So we're analysing stretches of text, not just sentences. Traditional grammar, including the way that Greek is still taught in the majority of manuals and faculties today, is sentence-based. So, for example, it's traditionally taught that word order in Greek is free. Because on the level of a sentence, comparing one with another, you might sometimes see the subject before the verb, sometimes afterwards. In other words, it's free. Sometimes you might see the pronoun, the object pronoun at the beginning of the sentence or the end, because word order is free. Now, what discourse analysis finds is that nothing is ever totally free. It can be flexible, but it's not free. In other words, you can't just do whatever you like, no more than you could with traditional sentence syntax. So word order is flexible. You can move word order around, but you can't do just whatever you like. When I showed Stephen Levinson my list, I had no idea of its significance, but I showed him my list of categories. So we have definite article, word order, conjunctions, prepositions. There are other things, I can't even remember what they are off the top of my head. And he said, he looked at the list and he said, but that's what discourse analysis looks at. So from there, we started working together. And the first work we did together was looking at the use of the article before proper names of people in the Book of Acts. And at that point, he didn't know why sometimes there was the article before Peter, for example, or Jesus, and sometimes there wasn't. And when I told him, yeah, well, if you look at manuscripts, you don't even find the same patterns. So we worked out in the end that the article is there by default. So normally you'll say ho Petros, the Peter. And if you omit the article, it's because you want to draw attention to that name. And that could be because it's the first time the guy's mentioned, which actually had already been noted, but that was the only thing that had been, only reason for dropping the article that had been noted. What we also found was if you wanted to contrast two people, you might omit the article. If you wanted to specially focus on a person. So, for example, if Peter's been mentioned, but he's been out of focus, we often use the image of a theatre stage. And if he's there on stage, but the spotlight has moved away from him for a while, it's focusing on somebody else. But now the spotlight's come back to Peter, then you might omit the article. Because it's like you've brought the spotlight back onto him. Yeah. So that was a very specific application of discourse analysis to variant readings. Because now what I found was when I compared the manuscripts, it's not the scribe who has a habit of using the article or not, because that wasn't even borne out by analysing one manuscript or another. It was more that one author saw or wanted to highlight a contrast and an author didn't want to highlight a contrast. Or maybe there was some words that weren't there in that manuscript, so there was no need to highlight a contrast. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Absolutely.
But, yeah. And so then we found the same thing with word order, for example, and conjunctions. And so
And what got you into Codex Bezae? All of that's real. Then you decided Bezae was one that you wanted to look at from a manuscript tradition. What got you to that point?
Okay, yeah, because as I said, the first thing I looked at, Bezae is missing, 837. Yeah, my second assignment at Lyon was Acts 12. There's a mention, I think it's 12:11, when Peter's being brought out of the prison by this angel, and he goes through an iron door that opens of his own accord, and in Codex Bezae, he went down 7 steps. Oh, that must be a scribe who happens to have local knowledge of the prison in the first century in Jerusalem, is the traditional explanation, despite the fact that usually you would say that the scribe was late. The Codex Bezae, I should say, was copied only in 400. The actual copy of the manuscript is 400. As Christian Fou kept insisting, the date of a manuscript is not the date of the text it transmits. That's axiomatic. But whereas textual criticism normally would say, because that manuscript's only 400, it must be a later scribe who's embroidered it. Yeah, he's thrown in some additional details. And those 7 steps, well, that must be a scribe who happened to know there were 7 steps leading out of the prison into Jerusalem. Again, I read that to my husband, who immediately said, well, yeah, the whole of this passage is the Exodus in reverse. So very briefly, the Jewish expectation was, when the temple was standing, that on the night of Passover, the Messiah would come into the temple through the eastern door. He would go through the first court and the second court and into the Holy of Holies. Okay. And Ezekiel, in his later chapters, has a vision of a restored third temple, if you like, and he's very detailed in the measurements. And there's one particular detail, which is how many steps between each of the courts and the Holy of Holies. And there's one place where there are 7 steps, and it's the last set of steps going into the city. And without going into detail now, when you've got the 7 steps there, together with a lot of other clues throughout Acts 12, what happens is that this is the night of Passover that it happens. The angel is taking Peter through the first prison, then a second prison, through an iron door that opens of its own accord, down 7 steps into the city. And then that changes everything, because now we have the trajectory of the Messiah, but in reverse. Yeah, where the prisoners become the temple, and Peter is being brought out. And in fact, when he comes to his senses, because he thought until then he was just seeing a vision, when he comes to his senses, what he says is, now I know that the Lord has delivered me from the expectations of the Jews. Which could mean just, yeah, they wanted to kill me, but they didn't manage it. Or it's much bigger than that. And it's that the Jews expect the Messiah to come on the night of Passover, because they don't think that Jesus is him. And I'm done with that. All my Jewish expectations, they're gone.
Yeah.
And that's when I realized, first of all, that's 2 instances. Okay, we didn't have Bezae for 837, but we had other manuscripts that had a Jewish context. And now we've got 1211 with the preceding verses as well that can be best explained by a Jewish context. So my interest was, well, what about the rest of Acts? So that's why Bezae.
Right.
I'd seen this, not just one variant reading, but a whole. And the whole thing only makes sense. You can only see the Jewish context if you read it as a continuous text.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In continuity. Yeah.
Exactly.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Which text criticism hasn't allowed us to do.
No. And as I said, the critical apparatus at the bottom of the page is too fragmentary. It's too traditional criticism treats variant readings atomistically. In other words, separated.
One at a time.
Yeah, exactly. Rather than seeing them as connected.
Yeah. So you have, maybe for our audience, Greg and I in a podcast a month or 2 ago talked a bit about textual criticism, but maybe for our audience it'd be helpful for them to get an understanding of this concept of the Western text of Acts versus the Alexandrian text of Acts. We did our podcast, we talked about Westcott and Hort and how that influenced downstream, that we see in the Nestle-Aland edition that you talked about. But for our audience, I think it would be helpful to do a remedial session on what that looks like.
Okay, so I can show you maybe afterwards a map of what is called the Western text. It's actually a term that was invented in the 18th century by a man called Griesbach. Textual criticism generally there's a lot of German scholars in the 17th, 18th centuries who were working on textual criticism. And Griesbach is the man responsible for calling it the Western text. And that's because Codex Bezae was found in Lyon, in France, just by coincidence that I happened to study it there. I don't think we even paid particular attention. When I was there, 81 to 83, we didn't even particularly pay attention to Lyon being the birthplace, or not the birthplace, the lodging place of Codex Bezae. So because it was found in Lyon, it was actually found in the 16th century, during the Wars of Religions, when the Protestants burnt down, or destroyed, a church in Lyon, actually the church of Saint Irenaeus, 2nd century church father, end of the 2nd century. He was based in Lyon. He was the Bishop of Lyon in the towards the end of the 2nd century. And this manuscript was found in the crypt of the church that was dedicated to his memory. It has, on parallel facing pages, a Latin translation, and then other Western manuscripts, and I really mean Western as in the West, or Western confirmation of the text of Bezae is found in the early church fathers, Tertullian, Irenaeus, and Justin. So it was associated with the Western church. It was conveniently overlooked that the earliest translations in the East also supported, not word for word, but in many places, you have readings in the Greek of Codex Bezae that actually are only found in the translations, the early translations before their text is standardized, in Syriac, Coptic, and Aramaic. Middle Egyptian, which is a dialect of Coptic. So in the first 4 centuries, 3.5 centuries, 3 centuries, until the middle of the 4th century, those early versions were circulating in diverse forms. We know that was also true for Latin, because it's in the 4th century that Jerome was asked to make a standardized edition, which we now know is called the Vulgate. But those other languages also have their Vulgate in the 4th century. We have quite a few copies of pre-Vulgate translations in Syriac, Coptic, Aramaic, Middle Egyptian, of Acts especially. And we can see that they very often support readings in Codex Bezae. Now, that's not apparent even in, so I mentioned this pocket edition of Nestle Aland in around 2017. A much bigger critical edition of Acts was brought out. These bigger editions are called Editio Critica Major, the big critical edition, where they have many more variant readings. Okay. But even there, it's not apparent just how much support is coming from these early versions. We use the word version to mean translation. So these early versions, which are in the East. So the word Western was taken up by Westcott and Hort, and because as a group of manuscripts, they are so often at variance with the manuscripts that dominate in Alexandria by the 4th century. So that is Codex Vaticanus, which I mentioned, and Codex Sinaiticus. But Sinaiticus wasn't discovered until it's 19th century. Vaticanus was known already in the 16th century. Then archaeologists find Sinaiticus. Then they find early papyri predating Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which are dated around 350. When they start finding papyri, 3rd century papyri that support these manuscripts, it looks as though they're the earliest text. And there is a lot more agreement among those Alexandrian type manuscripts than we get between Bezae and the early versions. But I should also mention that as towards the latter half of the 20th century, archaeologists have also been finding papyri, again in the East, Sinai Desert, Alexandria, the rubbish dumps of Egypt, Oxyrhynchus, for example. They're finding papyri, they have been finding papyri, that also support Codex Bezae. But often not as a whole. I don't think we haven't found anything that consistently supports Codex Bezae. Part of that is because these papyri are fragmentary. So that's how the concept came about, and then because, with Westcott and Hort, as you mentioned, at the end of the 19th century, they ruled that this text of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus especially was neutral. It doesn't have any tendencies. And so then it becomes, well, I would say it's become the new Textus Receptus. So a Textus Receptus was what Erasmus presented to the world back in the 1500s, where he looked at two Byzantine manuscripts, because they were really all that was available in those days, and said, okay, I've compared these Byzantine manuscripts. This is the result by putting them together and coming up with a sort of common edition. This is the Textus Receptus. Now, that is the text, as you may know, behind the King James translation that was made in the 1600s. I would argue, and I do argue, that the Nestle-Aland text, which is very similar to what Westcott and Hort put together at the end of the 19th century, that is a new Textus Receptus. And it's conditioned exegesis ever since. It also conditions textual criticism. And so most thinking about Codex Bezae in the 20th century, 21st, takes the Nestle-Aland text as the closest possible to the original, what they call the initial text, and then they compare Bezae with it. And I'm saying, well, supposing you turn that around, supposing you take Bezae as earlier and you compare the Nestle-Aland text with it. And so I've used the image of walking down a river, and I can send you this image. You're walking down a river and you see things from your starting point. You start at this bridge and you walk down a couple of miles down towards another bridge, and you see things and you observe them and you make notes on them. And then you turn around and you come back the other way, and you're seeing exactly the same things, but you're seeing them from a different angle. And so you interpret them differently. So it's not that, well, actually, some of the things have been missed, because some details you can only see when you come back the other way. And I would argue that is particularly the Jewish context. You can only see it if you come back the other way.
Interesting. Now, there's this concept with the German textual critics, well, and the Metzger and others, that the shorter readings are earlier, and the more difficult readings are earlier. How would you test those two methodological positions?
So that again is Griesbach, his golden rules. He had others as well, but those are the two dominant ones that have hung on. That depends on a preconception of the text. Supposing your longer readings, in Codex Bezae in particular, reflect Jewish concerns and preoccupations, which, as the church detaches from its Jewish roots, which doesn't happen all at once, it's still going on way into the 4th century, bit by bit, these Jewish references, and it's not quotations, it's ways of seeing things, it's a mentality, a lot of the time, so I'm talking about readings in Codex Bezae, a lot of the time it's references to tradition that's only known orally in the first couple of centuries. It's interpreting Jesus and his teachings within, as part of Judaism. As the church detaches from Judaism, a lot of that either doesn't make sense, or because the church is wanting to separate from its Jewish roots, it's material that would rather not be there. And so it's excluded. So the whole principle, but you see, this is way back in the 18th century when people had it's only, okay, I'm going to do an aside. It's only in the last 50 years that we've really begun to understand how the church separated from Judaism. In Griesbach day, in fact, until the Second World War, the idea was the church separated with the fall of the temple in 70. That was the end of it. Yeah. In fact, even before that, Jesus was responsible for starting Christianity, or maybe just about it was Paul, but things separated at least by the time of Paul. From the Second World War, that interpretation of the separation is beginning to be modified. And Christianity, if you like, after the Second World War, is seen as you have to look at Judaism as its background. Okay, so it's like we have a river, Christianity's on this side, we've got Judaism in the background, and we have to understand, we have to interpret the New Testament against that background. Since the late 90s, even that's changed. And what we would say now, we'd want to put Christianity over the other side of the river, in the first century anyway, as part of Judaism. So this is, as I said, Griesbach could not have done this, nor could Westcott and Hort. The Nestle-Aland Committee today could do it if they weren't governed by traditional textual criticism. But what is happening today is that with things like the discovery of the Qumran manuscripts and through Jewish textual criticism of its own writings, it's increasingly being seen and recognized and understood that in the first century, there is no such thing as one block of Judaism. There's various tendencies.
Yes.
And those who accept Jesus as the Messiah, that becomes one strand of Judaism. But to interpret it properly, you've got to see it within Judaism. In many ways, you could perhaps compare it to a Christian denomination. If you want to understand Protestantism, you can't just extract it totally from the whole of Christian tradition. You need to set it in context to understand it properly. So what I would contend is that when you read Codex Bezae in that context, then things become understandable. And you can see that's not an addition. You couldn't possibly add that in if you didn't think with a Jewish mentality, if you didn't know the Jewish oral traditions, and if you weren't wanting to interpret Jesus in continuity with Judaism. So that's to answer your question about how about you could call these additions.
No, that's a great explanation.
Yeah, and you're really taking on Griesbach's assumption that shorter is earlier and then everything else is embellishments. What I hear you saying is that maybe the Bezae longer text is truer to an earlier context.
Yeah.
That is more within Judaism, and the shorter text is actually eliminating. Am I getting that right?
Absolutely.
And so it reverses the order of text criticism's rules.
Flips it on its head. Yeah.
But I would also say that maybe the shorter text is more appropriate for the Christian church, which has detached from its roots. I'm not saying, therefore, we should all read the Codex Bezae today. I would, but only if you get proper teaching on the first century Jewish context.
Right.
Yeah.
Without it, if the Christian church prefers to use the you might want to call the non-Jewish context text, that it's probably easier to work with, and it makes more sense today.
Talk a little bit about on that note, Jenny. They're called Western non-interpolations. I think Can you introduce our audience to those and how you construe those as part of your methodology?
This is precisely part of the what's it called? Confirmation bias. No, the other one. Presuppositions. There's a series of readings, especially in Luke, towards the end of Luke, which are shorter. Sorry, they're not there in Codex Bezae, but they are there in the Alexandrian manuscripts. Okay, so you could call those Alexandrian interpolations. But because it had already been decided that the Western text was the bad one, they call them Western non-interpolations, which is, and to me, that's disingenuous, because you're really saying these are interpolations, but because we don't want to say they're Alexandrian interpolations, because we've already decided that's the best text, then we'll say they're Western non-interpolations. I don't know if I can think offhand of any one. And you need to understand them, you need to see them in context. So maybe we could talk about that next time.
Yeah, we can talk about it in episode 2.
Right.
Yeah.
It sounds like one of those cases.
I don't think we gave that to you beforehand, so I apologize.
It sounds like one of those cases where our language is giving us away.
Yeah. I mean, I might want to say it's even deceitful, because I think it is. They're Alexandrian interpolations, or else they're Western omissions. But to call them Western non-interpolations is to skew the whole discussion.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
They should be arguing why they were left out in the Alexandrian tradition if they're, that's the flip side of the argument.
So they're in the Alexandrian tradition, but they're not in the Western.
Yeah.
And the point being that usually the Western is longer, but just for these 10, they happen to be short. The Western text happens to be shorter.
Jenny, we're running short on time here, and
Yeah.
we want to wrap this up in 10 minutes or so. But before we do so, I think it's worth talking a bit about how you argue that, this atomistic, where you look at one little chunk at a time, and then you come up with, well, this we'll pull from this textual tradition here as the authentic reading, and this one here. And obviously using, shorter is better and more difficult is better. But you argue that you need to read these different manuscripts as a whole, as a consistent document, which we rarely ever do. Talk a bit about your argument there.
Okay. So, sorry, I'm just wondering where to start. So, yeah, because readings are viewed atomistically, it's often said when I talk about a particular, like the 7 steps, well, maybe that was just one thing that the scribe wanted to add in. Whether you say it's because he knew the geography, or maybe he did see some kind of Jewish interpretation, Jewish message behind the text. That's just the scribe who wanted to add that in. Okay. If it was just that reasoning could be valid. The thing is, it's not just that. So throughout the book of Acts, and when I went on to look at the Gospel of Luke, that's the same. I'm currently working on the Gospel of John with the team in Toulouse. We're finding exactly the same there. A PhD student who worked with me a few years ago found the same kind of thing in the Gospel of Matthew. We're finding that, I would say, certainly in every chapter, if not every page of Acts, there is Jewish material. So if this is a scribe putting it in, my question then is, what historical circumstances do we have in which a scribe would want to add in Jewish material that's not just quotations? In understanding, recognizing the purpose of this material, the meaning of it, you have to be familiar with Jewish exegetical techniques, which are not the same as Christian ones. You have to be familiar with Jewish oral tradition, and you sometimes have to be familiar with Hebrew and Aramaic. So that's for the Jewish material. Okay, maybe somewhere there was a community that wanted to make the text more Jewish. But then you have to square it with 2 other things. One is that throughout the book of Acts, throughout the Bezae text, the author is critical of the apostles. He presents the apostles as only gradually understanding properly the message of Jesus. Starts with Peter. In Acts 1, he makes a mistake in proposing to replace Judas. He shouldn't have done that. He got it wrong. And it continues through Paul, who made a number of mistakes because he wanted to try and make sure that the Jews believed in sufficient numbers before Gentiles came in and took over. And that was an error. And Codex Bezae is very clear. And that's just 2 of them, but the others make mistakes as well. So we've not now only got to have a context where we want to emphasize the Jewish material, we also want to say that these apostles weren't perfect from the start. They made mistakes. And now there's another thing, which is that the language, and this goes back to my linguistic analysis, the language, when looked at from the point of view of discourse analysis, is coherent. So just as we said earlier, there's reasons for keeping or dropping the article before proper names. There's reasons also for changing word order from its default order. There's reasons for using participles rather than conjugated verbs. And from a linguistic point of view, the text of Bezae enacts is coherent. It's not, well, here it does that and here it does the other. Once you've understood the principles of discourse analysis, it's very coherent. So we now have three things working together that tend to show this manuscript is not just the work of some scribe later who decided to add a few things in. Apart from anything, and this was actually back in my PhD thesis, I counted up how many times in Acts, how many of the variant readings are missing from the Alexandrian text, how many of them are present in the Alexandrian text but missing in Bezae, how many of them involve word order, and I have another category, word order, presence, omission, and how many of them the readings are there in both texts, but they might change the vocabulary, for example. So I have 4 categories of readings, and I found that the majority of the variants are actually to do with changes in meaning.
Interesting.
The majority are not to do with additional material. And just to put once and for all, if possible, to correct the popular, and it was popularized by Metzger, the percentage of material that's extra in Codex Bezae. He says 10%. It's not. It's 6% when you compare it with the material that's also missing. So to say Bezae is 10% longer is actually, it's another one of those things, I don't like to say deceitful, but it's somebody trying to skew the figures so that it goes with what they want to do.
Yeah.
In fact, Bezae, if it's longer, it is longer, but it's only 6.6.
Not that much longer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Most of the variants are to do with changes in meaning. So vocabulary or tenses, things like that.
Right.
Fascinating.
Well, one of the things I think,
Good, Greg, sorry.
I was going to say, one of the things that I hope our listeners will tempt you to come back for the second half of this is you were just commenting on the Jewish character of Bezae, which goes against some other people who would say it's actually the opposite way. It's an anti-Jewish. And so we look forward to looking at some of the specific examples and texts that you've worked on to help explain it, as you've given some examples here. So we'll delve into that a little bit more. That's for me one of the very exciting things about the work that you're doing.
Yeah.
So, but
Yeah,
Pat, I'll let you.
Article in 1966 or whenever in the 60s that he published. It was anti-Semitic. You turn that on its head and you argue the exact.
He doesn't say it's anti-Semitic. He actually specifically says not that. It's anti-Judaic. And I would argue it is anti-Judaic. I wouldn't disagree with him in exactly the same way as the Jewish prophets criticize Israel. If Bezae is anti-Judaic, then so are the Old Testament prophets.
Yeah.
It's when you're inside that you're best placed to do your criticism.
Yeah.
So I don't quibble with Epp on it being anti-Judaic. I might quibble with the terminology, but yes, it criticizes the Jews much more than the Alexandrian text.
Right.
Interesting. Well, we are going to save for episode 2, which will be a fascinating conversation. One last question I have that, there's been a few, as always is the case, scholars who've written that they disagree with you. Probably Zachary Dawson's, he has an article in Biblica.
Yeah.
And he argues that your analysis is an overreach. I guess I don't want to overstate what he said, but he argues that the Western text is still redactional. Makes a number of arguments for that. How would you respond to him?
This is a difficult one because that particular article, I contacted Biblica because Zachary Dawson seriously misrepresents both myself and my colleague Reeves Camps. He applies my thinking, my comments about discourse analysis that I use elsewhere he applies it to the apostolic decree, which actually I have never done. He also makes statements which things like I use discourse analysis. I attempt to use discourse analysis to identify Jewish material. I don't do that at all. It's actually the other way around. So I did actually contact Biblica to protest and say this is a misrepresentation. They were going to pull the article because they agreed with me. And in the end, they left it because the particular reader who had vouched it was one of Biblica's respected elderly members, and they felt it could look as criticism of him if they pulled it. They offered me the opportunity to write another article to challenge Dawson's statements, and I decided not to do that. In a sense, I mean, I do mention his article in especially my latest books. But yeah, it's quite a serious misunderstanding, but I would say even worse, a misrepresentation of what I say. So
Is this just an example of the kind of difficulty that your approach, which is so different for people, is this just an example of the kind of trouble that scholarship has when they're trying to come to terms with this approach that you're taking?
I think so, because yeah, it's so in saying that discourse analysis, I mean, the way I argue it, the way I use it, he argues that it overreaches what it's capable of. Discourse analysis in itself is a huge field, and I take one particular approach of discourse analysis, and that's not what he does. And he's not looking at the Jewish context. So I don't use discourse analysis to identify Jewish context. I identify Jewish context. It's actually the other way around. I see Jewish context and I say, oh yeah, well, the way the language is phrased, that brings out that Jewish context. So my 7 steps, I didn't find that through discourse analysis. The apostolic decree, I didn't find the reason I don't apply the reason I don't apply discourse analysis to the apostolic decree is that there's nothing there that discourse analysis affects one way or the other. It's the actual content, which I was going to say I actually put we can talk about this next time, but I put the apostolic decree Bezae form to Jewish scholars, Jewish historians, rabbinic scholars. And I said, can you make any sense of this? And they said, well, yeah, that's what every Jew believes. And then I read to them the more familiar Christian text, and they said, well, that doesn't make sense within a Jewish context. So that's why I say his particular article in Biblica is to do with the apostolic decree. And I do not apply discourse analysis to it. There's nothing in that apostolic decree that's worthy of a discourse analysis approach. So he attacks my discourse analysis work and then says, well, because she's wrong about the apostolic decree, her discourse analysis is wrong. And as I said, Biblica accepted. They agreed that he sets out to discredit me.
Well, I think we're about out of time. The next episode, we're going to talk a little bit more about the Jewish character of Acts in Codex Bezae. We'll talk about Luke 24. You have some really interesting views there, which I don't think we've talked about hardly at all during today's podcast, which is good. We'll talk about the Exodus theme in Acts, which we have touched on some, or you have, which I find fascinating. You mentioned the reading of Peter in Acts 12, but you've written extensively on Barnabas, and I don't think we've talked about him at all, so that'll be interesting. You mentioned the apostolic decree. We'll dive into that, and then we'll look at practical outcomes for ministers and lay leaders and lay teachers. What do they do with all this if Codex Bezae is really much earlier you're going to argue, I suspect, that you need to read it in continuum, not in little atomistic pieces, as we tend to do from a text critical standpoint. So we're really excited about episode 2, and I'm sure our audience, after listening to this episode, should be. If they aren't, then they weren't listening to today's conversations.
We invite you to consider some of Jenny's more recent works out in paperback, including Luke in His Own Words, a study of the language of Luke Acts in Greek. Also Luke's demonstration to Theophilus, the Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles according to Codex Bezae. The Message of Acts in Codex Bezae, Volume 1, a comparison of the Alexandrian tradition, Acts 1:1 to 5:42, Jerusalem. And Luke's characters in their Jewish world, Being Theophilus, a 2026 publication.
For other podcast episodes of Scriptural Works featuring co-hosts Greg Camp and Patrick Spencer, as well as a variety of different special guests, visit us at scripturalworks.com, YouTube, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. And don't forget to check out the growing repository of podcast companion articles found at scripturalworks.com. And finally, if you find our podcast episodes thought-provoking and helpful, make sure to share them on your social channels.